This is Beyond the Green Screen, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everyone. Meteorologist Royal Norman. Welcome to Beyond the Green Screen, the Arizona First Alert Weather Team's podcast. And our great guest today is a fellow I've known for a long time, Randy Cerveny, meteorologist, climatologist from ASU. Randy, how long you been at ASU about?
Since about the time that you graduated, which is now some 35 years.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I finished up. Randy was never one of my instructors, but I finished up, and within a year or two, you were on the staff.
That's right.
And I will share this with folks that although I never took a class from Randy, he's always been a super, super big mentor for me because I would call him up and say, Randy, I don't get this. Randy, what's happening here? What's this? And he'd always take the time to help me out and figure things out for me. So, Randy, thank you for that. You were like my teacher after I was taught.
Hey, and you have been a great source of information for us because some of the stories that we have about some of the old meteorologists that existed here in the valley, like the famous Mr. Smidley.
Yes. Yes.
You have some great stories,
Yes.
and so for keeping a weather history of the valley, you've been invaluable.
Yeah, I really am. I'm really intrigued by the history, and Schmidley's the guy who, as you know, it was kind of funny when we used to do the dew point thing to start the monsoon.
That's right.
Everybody was on board with the 3 straight days of 55 degrees of average dew points or more to start it. But it was only Schmidley who finished it.
Oh,
for like 25 years. Okay, Schmidley called it. The monsoon's over. So the date thing, we'll talk about the date thing some other time. I want to talk about your new book. You got a new book coming out. It's called Judging Extreme Weather. It'll be out next year. And it's interesting to me because I'm always looking at weather records, and I tend to look at weather records sometimes, and I'll say, does that make sense? Like you'll see a number. So for you sent me some of the chapters, and I read that. For you, the moment was Katrina. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of inspiration for this particular book and for the work that I do with the World Meteorological Organization all kind of came together in 2005. I was listening to the horrific coverage of Hurricane Katrina making landfall near New Orleans and all the death and destruction that took place, which was really bad. But I heard a journalist on TV going, "This is the worst hurricane of all time." Mm-hmm. And while, I can kind of understand in the spur of the moment, people will say things to make things, more good for the audience or to engage the audience. Mm-hmm. That's just flat out wrong. Yeah. I mean, Katrina was a bad storm, but it was nowhere near the worst storm that we've had in the United States. I mean, you go back to the Galveston storm of 1900, the one that is called Isaac Storm. We didn't name hurricanes back then, but it's gotten kind of named Isaac Storm after the book that was written about it.
Yeah.
A fantastic book. That killed over 6,000 people. I mean, Katrina killed 2,000. Yeah. Nasty storm. But this Isaac Storm of 1900 was the worst natural disaster we've had in the United States.
Period.
And, I think our history loses. We were just talking about, losing history. I think our history loses something if we don't have a record that we can depend on. And if somebody says, oh, this was the worst storm, and it wasn't, we lose something, I think.
And so that got you started, but then you kept going on the hurricanes, and not all hurricanes are called hurricanes around the world. They have different names. And I read this, and I was astounded about the actual worst, I guess we'll call it a tropical cyclone. Would that be proper?
Right. That's the general name.
Yeah, so tell us about the worst tropical cyclone in the world.
Oh, that was horrific.
Yeah.
It was back in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And at that particular time, Pakistan was split into two parts on either side of India. We had East Pakistan, we had West Pakistan, and West Pakistan being the bigger of the two countries. Right. There was a tremendously big tropical cyclone that came up the Bay of Bengal. And the average elevation of what was that time East Pakistan was only about 5-10 feet off sea level. Well, this put a sea wave into the area that was 20 foot tall. Yeah. And there was no infrastructure, no way to warn the population. And estimate, because it's the best that we can do, we estimate that 300,000 people, almost a third of a million people, died in that one particular storm. The storm was so bad and the death toll was so bad that part of Pakistan rebelled due to the hurricane and actually formed the country of Bangladesh. I mean, it's the weird story of how a country became a country due to a natural disaster, in this case, that particular tropical cyclone.
Because of weather.
Because of weather.
That is an interesting story. And so not all the stories are like that dramatic. I do love the fact that we in the media do tend to say something's the biggest or the grandest or the, whatever. That happens. And sometimes it's just a slip of the tongue. But I love it that there are folks like you who are willing to go out there and sort of double check it and make sure that's the truth. So Hawaii, you had a report of 50 inches of rain at Kauai one time. How did you figure out if that was right or wrong?
Well, actually, we have different groups that are associated with severe weather across the world. Mm-hmm. And when I started this project back in actually 2007, after that Katrina situation, and I got it approved all the way through different channels, I was left with trying to figure out how we were going to put this together. Well, I found out that each country has its own way of assessing an extreme weather record in the country. And so for the United States, it's something called the National Climatic Extremes Committee. They're the ones that actually did that with Hawaii.
Okay.
And so whenever a new record happens in the United States, the hottest, coldest, wettest, whatever it might be, then we have that committee, and that committee consists of one of the top people in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, somebody from the group of what we call state climatologists. Each of our states has a state climatologist, and then somebody from the particular area in which that disaster took place, or that particular record took place. Yeah. They evaluate that. Maybe sometimes there's some other people as well, and they determine whether or not the measurement was taken properly. Well, the problem was, and they only formed in the United States back in about 97, and they did that little study that you just mentioned for Hawaii and verified that record was placed. But when I got up and started looking for world records, I found that there was no group that did that. The only group that I could find, and now, by the way, I'm actually a consultant to them, is the Guinness Book of World Records. But they're not official. They're not. They're just a private company. Right. So I made the problematic statement of saying we need to have something for the world. And
and then someone said, okay, go ahead and do it.
That's it, exactly. I presented in a little place in Spain a proposal for putting together a world committee to examine records, and they said, oh, this is a great idea. Why don't you do it?
So that's what we're doing now.
That's what we're doing now.
So with the Kauai thing, just to get back up for a second, you mentioned a tipping bucket and things, rain gauges and all that kind of stuff. So how do you determine that, like, if my rain gauge at home recorded 50 inches and this rain gauge in Kauai recorded, which one is right or wrong? And is it exact science, or is it a little bit of magic?
It's gotten to be an increasingly exact science.
Okay.
I mean, so like, for example, for new temperature records that we have across the world, we actually now take the sensor that was used to record that, the electronic measuring device that was used to record that temperature. It is taken off of wherever it's at, and a replacement is put in. We ship that to a testing laboratory that makes sure that the instrument was what we call calibrated, that when it was recording a given temperature, that was the actual temperature that was recording. Yeah. And we've done that now a number of times. The third and fourth highest temperatures that we've recorded in the world were done, and they occurred, by the way, in Pakistan and in Kuwait just about 4 years ago. Those temperatures we have verified to the nearest hundredth of a degree.
Wow. Wow.
The testing labs today are incredible. And that allows us to have really good faith that the records that we talk about when we start talking about climate change, that it's hotter or colder than it's ever been, hotter, now.
Right.
We can say that with confidence that what we are actually measuring is what is actually happening.
Yeah. So, didn't you all throw out a hot record in, I want to say, Libya, Azizia, Libya? You did, didn't you? I remember this. What was the alleged temperature, and why did you? It was supposed to be the hottest ever on Earth, right?
That is right. For 100 years, it was considered to be the hottest temperature on Earth, 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's for a little town, Azizia. You mentioned it's actually a suburb now of Tripoli.
Yeah.
And we had a climatologist there who had uncovered the actual physical logbooks from that particular time. And this was back in 2010. We said, ooh, this looks interesting. Let's open an investigation, because the logbooks were showing a big error, and I'll talk about that here in just a second.
Yeah.
But we started an investigation in 2010. Now, the interesting thing about doing it in 2010 is Libya at that time was under the control of Colonel Gaddafi. And so the person that I was working with was working with the Gaddafi government. He was a meteorologist with the Gaddafi government.
Yeah.
Revolution took place. Gaddafi was overthrown. We lost contact for about 8 months with my contact in Libya. And I was thinking, oh goodness, did he die? Didn't know what did actually happen. Then one day I got a short email that said, basically, I am alive. I'll have more later. What had happened is, when the rebels were invading into Tripoli, he and his family snuck out in the dead of night, bullets firing over his head, he said, and they got to the rebel line, and he joined the rebels. After that time, he got his old job back, but now he was working for the rebel government. Anyway, we were able then eventually to get back to the investigation, and we found out that, yes, the 136 degree observation that was done in Tripoli was made in error, that it was using a really bad instrument. It was done by a person who wasn't aware of how the instrument worked.
Familiar with it, yeah.
And you could tell that in the log sheet, because the guy was writing the observations in the wrong columns.
Oh, boy.
And what had happened, we found out, is back in 1923, when this actually occurred, that there had been an attack on the Italian base that was in control of that particular sector, and their normal meteorologist had been killed. And so they had a person take over. Once we have examined all the evidence, now we'll never know for sure whether or not it was a right observation, but all the evidence that we could collect suggests it was wrong. And my panel of experts told me, because of that, we should disallow that particular observation. It's not a decision we make lightly.
Right.
But we did. And that makes Death Valley 134 degrees now the hottest recorded temperature on the planet.
And you don't have a problem with 134 Death Valley. Right?
Well, I have seen that record.
Okay.
I have actually physically held the logbook.
Yeah.
And it was made in the proper manner. The instrument that was used is, for the time, the best instruments that they had available. We haven't got anything that tells us that observation was done in error.
I'm going to take you on a sidebar locally because of the heat that we had around here this summer, but also our 122 record, which we set way back in 1990, and we really haven't made a run at it, a serious run at it, in that much time, because the gauges have moved around the airport, as you know. That interests me for some reason. So the how would you, if we ever did get to 122 or more, how would that compare to where the record was set, which was in the, on the east side? That's what confuses me. These darn temperature gauges and weather stations move around, but I guess you got to take what you got, right?
We got to take what we got,
okay,
and we have to look at that in the context of where it's at. For as you say, the station that recorded the 122 is no longer located where it is. It is now actually several feet lower than it was, and it's kind of off of the main runway now and down towards the Salt River Valley. One of the guys that was an old meteorologist, friend of you and mine, by the name of John Skinloff, said when they moved that the difference in temperature between the old values and the new values could be as much as 1.5 degrees.
Wow.
So, but I still say that when that was made, and I made the prediction, I'm still thinking that my prediction is pretty good, that before we beat the 122, we will have another record that is more frightening, and that's that we won't get below 100 degrees.
Yeah.
And we got really close to breaking that record this summer.
Yes, that one is scary. That one is scary. And we saw this summer how the heat staying up at night, where we had that whole string where we didn't get out of the 90s.
Absolutely.
It just exacerbates everything. It's just crazy. So here's what I want to ask you. Heat extremes, do they relate to, you're a climatologist. Do they relate to the story of climate change? And how can it tell us or help us with climate change in terms of where it may be going, what we can do, that kind of thing?
Well, it's one of the big reasons why we created this particular project, why I was able to convince the World Meteorological Organization. And for people that don't know, the World Meteorological Organization is kind of the United Nations of weather services. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. is part of it, England is part of it, Australia is part of it, and I have experts from all those different places around the world when I create a committee that examines these particular records. But one of the big reasons that we created this was for study of climate change, because in order to study climate change and see how climate is changing, you need to know what is it doing now. In other words, we have to establish what we call a baseline. Mm-hmm. And we have to make sure that we can all accept that the temperatures that we are measuring in that baseline are accurate. Mm-hmm. So the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, says, yeah, this is a pretty good go. Since that time, by the way, I found out that there's lots of other reasons for doing this kind of stuff. For example, engineers need to know what are the strongest winds when they're designing a building. Doctors need to know how hot can it be, because we have to be able to handle heat stress and heat death. So there's been a lot of other groups that, since I formed the archive of weather extremes, have taken an interest in what we do. One of the groups, though, that I'm most proud of getting interested is kids. Kids love to talk about weather extremes. Mm-hmm. And I've been pleased that our work has actually led to some kids, they've told me, choosing weather as a career and getting into meteorology. Yeah. So that to me is one of the big accomplishments of our project.
Yeah. I love it when kids get interested in weather. That is for sure. This is Beyond the Green Screen, our podcast, First Alert Weather Team podcast. We're talking to Randy Cerveny, a meteorologist and climatologist from ASU. I do want to ask you one climatology question in terms of global climate change. And I know you and I don't talk politics. We just talk what, I think our friend Bob Balling says the data.
Yes.
Tell me what the data says to you, and tell me how you read it in terms of, is our climate changing or is it not?
Yes, our climate is changing, and it is changing because of us. I mean, it's become clearly obvious over the last few decades that the rate of change that we see in not only local, regional, and global temperatures is the result of what we are doing. And I hear people say, well, we got things like the urban heat island and other things. Yes, there's lots of different contributing factors, but overwhelmingly over the last few decades, the primary cause for increasing temperatures on the planet have been our own activities. I know people don't like to hear that. They don't like to be told that they've done something wrong. But in this particular case, the heat that we are getting is the result of us. I mean, here in Phoenix, for example, and across the entire state, it's really easy to kind of show that, yes, we have climate change going. When, Royal, was the last time that you recorded or announced on the air that we set a record cold temperature in Arizona?
I believe it was 1996.
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. When was the last time that we set a record high temperature?
Last month.
Yeah. and that's across the state. That's not just the metropolitan Phoenix area. So what we are seeing is a widespread change in climate. Now, I'm not going to say that what we should do about it, because that's not what I am. I'm not a policy climatologist, but I can say with a surety that the facts are stating that our climate's getting warmer.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because that topic was big this summer. A lot of folks talking about the urban.
I was doing interviews all around the world about it.
but it's, to me, the thing that shows about Arizona heating up is that, yes, you can look at Phoenix, but you can look at Tucson and Prescott and Flagstaff and Yuma, and those are not as big a cities as Phoenix, and they're warming up too.
Exactly. And in fact, even with Phoenix, what we've noticed, one of our good friends, a guy by the name of Tony Brazel, has been studying the urban heat island for decades. And what he's noticed about it is it's leveled off. Yeah. That our city has, in terms of influencing temperature, kind of stopped doing that in terms of increasing the temperature over the last about 20 or 30 years. That the increases in temperature that we are seeing are not the result of the urban heat island, because we've hit kind of the maximum amount of pavement that we can for the Phoenix metropolitan area.
Well, I hadn't heard that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's totally amazing. All right, you got a new book coming out. Tell us what the name of the book is and when it's coming out, Randy.
I'm really proud of this book because it is discussing what we do with the World Meteorological Organization. Talks about how we measure weather and how we determine whether something or not is an extreme. The book is going to be called Judging Extreme Weather, Climate Science in Action. It's kind of an academic book, so unfortunately it's going to be a little more expensive than your trade paperback, I'm afraid. Yeah. But it's published by Routledge Publishing, and it's going to be due out in February of 2024. So I'm really proud of it. The one thing that I'm really proud about it is that it tells the personal stories in each chapter of my committee members that are evaluating the weather. I can pick the best of the best to study climate. And so I have Nobel Prize winners that are in this particular book. I have some of the biggest names in meteorology in this book, and they tell me their personal stories.
Well, and you did send me some excerpts, and I'll tell folks that my other compliment to Randy on that was you wrote it in a way that I could understand it. It's when he says it's a scientific thing, don't let that freak you out. It's very readable, very understandable, and very engaging. So I'm looking forward to the whole thing. I get to read the whole thing.
Well, thanks.
It's going to be interesting.
I appreciate that.
Randy, we're going to have you back a bunch on Beyond the Green Screen. You're just a amazing amount of information for someone here in Arizona. But before I let you go, here's the question I've got to ask you. Dust storm or haboob?
Well, actually, I depend on your particular expertise for this, because you've dug into this a little bit. One of the premier meteorologists, climatologists that was here in the Valley was a guy named Sherwood Idso, and he was recognized around the world for his work with dust storms.
Yes.
He published in our official technical journal of meteorology, something called the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, published an article, I think it was back in the 70s, that used that phrase, or that term, haboob, for the dust storms here in Arizona. So yes, the technical proper term for a dust storm here in Arizona is haboob.
All right, there you have it. Randy Cerveny. He's on the haboob team, Team Haboob. Randy, we'll have you back a bunch of times. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's Beyond the Green Screen.
This is Beyond the Green Screen, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.